Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to this Sunday Forum on Sunday, September the 11th. And we've got a sensitive topic this Sunday. We're going to talk about the following. Are Christians called to be woke or awake? And we'll distinguish those in a second because we're going to talk about pronouns. He and she and they and them. We're talking about transgender issues. And why are we discussing this? It's such a small percentage of Americans, about 5%. It's a low percentage of Americans who self-identify this way. And yet it's in the paper all the time. These groups have now become a part of the culture wars all over the United States and, of course, here in Florida as well. And so before we begin, because we're dealing with such a tough subject where there's a lot of emotion in the room, isn't there? We want to remember our 7 principles of discernment, of respect, of listening, of speaking only for ourselves, for understanding others' viewpoints, gratefulness, forgiveness, and of course the 8th commandment where we put the best construction on everything. So again, why is this subject so important? It's because there are these cultural wars that are swirling all around us. Florida is in particular, as I mentioned, and this topic has become one that touches not just our high schools, our elementary schools, but often then our education, what's allowed to be taught, but also how we practice sensitivity to our neighbors. Businesses now have often bought into certain sensitivities as well as the universities. And so it's a small topic, and it's a big topic, and it's one that's emotional for all of us. So now let me define what does woke mean, because it's thrown out quite a bit in the papers. Woke means being alert to injustice in society, especially issues of social justice. And today we're talking more about the sense of woke in terms of transgenders and the use of pronouns. Often the calling cry you hear is stay woke and keep fighting. All right, but there are groups who give a counter movement to the movement of being woke. And they are called, or they self-identify as being awake. And this movement comes often from conservative Catholic circles and evangelicals who say, okay, we also are alert, awake to injustice, but we would define it completely differently. And in terms of these pronouns, we reject the pronouns because we reject the philosophy that supports it. Now we're going to get to all that in a second. But I wanted to share, first of all, an interview with Pedro Wasmer. We had talked about this topic and how it had come up in his own life concerning the University of Maryland. He's an alumni, he loves the university, but he's critical of their position, of their wokeness over against pronouns. And so let's hear that interview right now. Well, Pedro, welcome to the Sunday Forum. It's good to be here in your home here in Naples, Florida.
Well, it's good to have you here.
Thanks.
As
Pedro, we've talked about the issue of pronouns and how that reflects a philosophy of wokeness. And I know, and you've told me that you've written a letter to the University of Maryland. You're an alumni of the University of Maryland. You love the University of Maryland, but you've had some criticism of their use of these pronouns. Could you just describe that for us?
Well, when I received a letter inviting me to a luncheon here in Naples by the president of the University of Maryland, and the first question in the form that I was sent to accept or reject the invitation was, what pronoun do you wish to use? That really bothered me. So I said, Mr. Now, that led to further discussions on this issue. First of all, I think if, as I've told Rick before, if Boswell, who was the biographer of Dr. Sam Johnson, had known Samuel Johnson when he was creating the first English dictionary. He could have given him, Boswell would have given him this advice. Don't invent words that don't exist. The English language, from the old Chaucerian English to where it is now, has progressed a lot. Don't start inserting terms and things that don't belong in the English language. Now, they didn't know each other then, but they got to know each other very well later.
So what you said in the letter, Pedro, if I understand it correctly, is you recognize there are some issues that need to be addressed, but not this way. I mean, you're not approving of how the university is addressing these.
Absolutely correct. The university, to me, is an institution of higher learning. I improved my English tremendously by going to the University of Maryland. I learned a lot, other than engineering, which is what I studied. I attended the University of Maryland. It's been very helpful. An institution of higher learning should not be screwing up the language that their students use to address issues and to address themselves. I find that very, very offensive.
So I just want to point out, Pedro, something that's obvious to both of us, that you wrote that letter of protest to the university, but you're wearing your University of Maryland shirt here for the interview.
I love the university, and they're playing their first football game of the season today against Buffalo. And I'm not going to watch it because Rick and I are going to go to lunch after we finish here. But in any case, I do love the university, and that's why I care enough to write a letter to the president and make some changes so it will be felt. I told the president in my letter that I was very disappointed that even he was using these pronouns. And he's a very intelligent man. And that I resented the fact that there's actually somebody who was a commissar for wokeness at the university who's paid $380,000 a year and has 41 assistants. That truly offended me. So I told the president that I was taking them off my will because they didn't need my money. They could spend $2.5 million a year on this stuff. So that's what I did. That's how I feel.
Well, I appreciate, Pedro, that you're willing to come on the Sunday Forum and tell us about the issue, because I think some of our members of Emmanuel are very much following these issues of wokeness and the pronouns in the papers, especially here in Florida, but others are not. And so it's good for them to hear that these are real life situations that affect our members each and every day. Again, thanks for being on the Sunday Forum, Pedro.
My pleasure. Thank you for interviewing me.
Okay, did you enjoy that interview? And you might be saying, okay, what is Pedro talking about? I mean, why did he respond to the university with a letter of critique? Well, I want to explain this in three different categories. In the first, we're going to talk about vocabulary, because for some of us, this topic is so new, we're not used to this vocabulary that's being used in public. But the second then is, why are people using now different pronouns? What are they trying to say? And third, what is the difference between these two movements of being woke or being awake? So first of all, let's review the vocabulary, again, because many of you use this vocabulary all the time, and for others you might be saying, oh, this is really all new material. So we want to get on the same page. And the first is a phrase, series of letters that you hear all the time, LGBT, which means lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. That's often used to describe a whole group of people here in the United States. But then often another letter is added, which is Q, which means queer. Now, initially, queer was used as a critique over against certain portions of the gay lesbian community, but now it's been embraced by certain groups, and here's the definition. Queer means a gender identity that does not correspond to established ideas of sexuality and gender. Again, queer means a gender identity that does not correspond to established ideas of sexuality and gender. In other words, someone looks at a man and a woman and he says, okay, I'm not that. Or she says, I'm not that. I'm different. I'm queer. So you hear now a distinction between sex and gender. And I grew up not making those distinctions, I have to be honest, but now often when we read about it in the paper, these distinctions are made. And the first is sex, talks about our natal sex, how we were born, our physical biology. And you'd say, oh, okay, like the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve, God made male and female. The scientists say, well, there's also a third category, which is considered intersex. It's a small group, but it's humans who have mixed biologies, okay, that they have some male parts and some female parts. Or sometimes their chromosomes are different than what would be expected. And so that's often considered intersex. And it's not then the clear binary of male and female. That has to do with biology, with sex, at least 3 categories. But now we move to gender, and often in the literature, gender is discussed as a social construct. We all know that, like parents, that, okay, you give dolls to play to girls, right, and baseball bats and gloves to the boys, and then all of a sudden, when they mix and the boys are playing with dolls and the girls are out playing baseball, okay, how do you do with that? Who wears pink, after all? Why is it that we define socially certain roles certain ways? Well, here gender is considered more a social construct. And now here's the thing. If your body corresponds to how you think about yourself, like when I grew up, I had the parts of a boy and I thought myself, yeah, I'm a boy, I'm a male. Then today in the new vocabulary, you're considered cisgender, which means your body corresponds to your gender identity. But so many are not. And so they're often referred to again as being queer when gender identity does not correspond to birth sex. And when you read the papers, other terms are used here, like non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer, and transgender. All those words are used for the same community. All right, let's go to part 2 now. When you've got this diversity of experience, often we'd say it's a small group who are transgender in the United States, maybe like 5%. So it's a small group, but it's a higher group among young people 13 to 17, where sometimes up to 1.5% will self-identify as queer. And so you need to be alert to this, especially with maybe your kids or your grandkids. A recent study that published in The Conversation, an academic journal, said that 3% of all incoming college students self-identified as transgender or queer. Now you might say that's not a very high number, but I think that was over 37,000 young people. So what are they trying to do? Now I know my son works for Apple in Philadelphia, and he's encouraged by his name on the website as an employee of Apple to put pronouns, he and him. That means he's cisgender. His body and his gender correspond. But now what they're trying to do is to say, well, even though you're, quote, part of the normal group, nevertheless, we want to show that as a company, we're sensitive to these minority communities. And a lot of businesses don't buy into the philosophy. They're just trying to be pragmatic. They're trying to sell stuff, right? Universities, like we heard with Pedro, well, they deal in ideas. And so often they've embraced certain ideas of wokeness, which has led them to their use of pronouns and their sensitivities to the transgender community. All right, so pronouns are ways of signaling your value. And here's where we see the woke community and the awake all trying to be sensitive to injustice in the world and to the transgender community, but some using a certain progressive philosophy, and others, the awake community, saying, we want to be sensitive to injustice, but we don't buy into those philosophies at all. But here's the interesting part. Of all those kids entering college who are saying we're not binary, 97% use the pronouns they, them, just so you know that. So if you were in the room, they would encourage you to say, I'm in the room with them, one person. Or they were with me, not he or she. And so it becomes quite confusing, and you got to get used to using these pronouns in new situations. But here's the thing, college students are increasingly identifying beyond the she and he, and they use all sorts of different gender identities, and I've read that 78 different pronouns, some of them just kind of made up. So that is the world we're living in, and it might be a family that you're living in. So part 3. All right, what are the differences? And I'm going to map this out this way, that you have this woke community and awake, both very committed to fighting injustice here in our country and around the world. Both strong commitments. But then you go down to language, and the woke community is going to be using pronouns like they and them for a transgender person, and the awake community is going to say, no, that's not the language we use, because that is leaning into progressive thought patterns which we reject. And so then that goes to a third level. What is the philosophy behind the use of these pronouns? And for some, the awake community says, you see, the woke group, they're neo-Marxists. They're dividing everybody up into categories of oppressed and oppressor. Victimhood runs rampant with that approach. And of course, on the woke community, they're looking at those who are awake and saying, oh, they're homophobic, they can't deal with diversity, and they will practice violence over against the transgender community. So when it comes to evaluation of each other, both communities, woke and awake, are pretty critical of the other side. In fact, both say if you use the wrong pronouns, whatever that might be, right, that's the Trojan horse. Whatever language you use is the Trojan horse for the opposing philosophies that are extant. All right, so what are my comments? And again, I want to invite you to the Sunday Forum where we can discuss this, particularly if this is something you're experiencing at work, for example, at the university would be another example, or maybe in your family. And how have you dealt with it? We want to hear those personal stories, just like Pedro shared his story with us. But first of all, here we can't, again, and I've said this before, we can't rely on politicians because they're not interested in educating us. They're interested in building constituencies. And often they use this in sharp ways to divide communities. And on this one, you can really beat up on the transgender community quickly because it's such a small minority group in the United States. And so we need places here like Emmanuel where we can talk and at least educate ourselves, even though we're going to come out on this one with very, very different experiences and opinions. But secondly, I have to say I admire the woke community because they are really out front, fighting injustice, fighting for the transgender community for greater sensitivity. But I really like the awake community because they're trying to use Christian ideas and thought, right, to explain both injustice and the prognosis. What do we do about it? There are weaknesses on both sides. The woke community, when they talk about their philosophies, it can lean really into dividing the community into oppressors and oppressed. All of a sudden you become a victim, even though you didn't even know what the issue was all about. But I think also from the awake community, often they spend too much time fighting the wokeness without using their energies to fight injustice in the country. So here are 3 ideas in the Christian world which I do think play a role. One is we believe in original sin, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. No one can hide behind that binary of oppressor and oppressed. We all have sinned and come short. But secondly, we use gospel language, which unites us. And I like communities who try to unite us, whether it's using a patriotic language, but here in the church we use gospel language so that we're all the body of Christ. We all are joined together. Christ died to bring us together around a common banquet table. And I want to hear that more from all these communities. Don't separate us. Try to use some language to unite us. And finally, in the church, we always do ministry to vulnerable communities. We don't always ask whether we agree or disagree, which is why, yeah, we do ministry in prisons. We don't agree with the prisoners, their lifestyle, or what they did. Sometimes we don't even get to talk about that, at least not initially. But we know in prison, these men and women are vulnerable. And the church always stands up for those who are struggling, who are vulnerable, who are suffering in our society. So let me close by saying that this topic is very sensitive, and so again, we'll want to be sensitive to each other and to the experiences that are out there, which are very emotional for parents, for educators, for teachers, for those who work within businesses where this has now become part of their daily routine. And so when we hear people use topics or terms like social justice or cisgender or they, them, non-binary identities or neo-Marxism, oh my goodness, we just got to calm down. First of all, to try to listen to people, because most people, it's just pragmatic. They're using that language because they're just trying to understand the world. They're not buying into a philosophy one way or the other. And yet, we can turn to universities and schools, certain books that are out there that can help us understand what are the philosophies out there, and so we can make, as Christians, an informed judgment about where we agree or where we disagree. But one more caution. I think this whole conversation is quite young. It may take a while for us to work through the vocabulary, the language, the philosophies, and yeah, even the evaluations, so that in the end, we use what we've learned so that we can love people no matter where they find themselves in life. So again, join us at the Sunday Forum this Sunday at 10:15, and we'll go a little deeper. Bring your stories with you. Thanks for joining us on the Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.